and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Elena Oceanic, and I am part of the innovation team at IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. We are an intergovernmental organization, and our membership spans most of the globe, with 160 member states worldwide, and with most other countries already in the process of accession. We support countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future, and we also serve as the principal platform for international cooperation, as well as a center of excellence, a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge, all on renewable energy. You can learn more about our full range of services and activities on our website, www.irena.org. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating the webinar entitled COVID-19 and Renewables, Impact on Energy System. Before we start, I would like to walk you through a few housekeeping items as follows. All of you are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. You can use the chat feature to introduce yourself and talk to other attendees. If you encounter any difficulties on a technical level, please write in the chat box. And if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the dedicated Q&A tab in the webinar panel. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the session and select some of them to be answered by our speakers at the end. We will also do our best to reply to as many questions as possible, but we also know that we cannot answer to all the questions. The slides will be shared via email at the end of the webinar. However, you may also download the presentation slides as well as the press release in the handout section. A recording will also be made available publicly in 48 hours. And we also encourage you to tell us how we did in the survey that will be shared at the end of the webinar to help us improve. And thank you very much at this point in advance for completing the survey. On today's agenda, we have two presentations from CEER, the Council of European Energy Regulators, and IRENA of approximately 15 minutes each, followed by a session in which the speakers will reply to your questions. At this point, please allow me to make some opening remarks on today's topic. Without any doubt, the COVID-19 infectious disease has affected our societies, and it has also impacted the energy sector worldwide. Although the full impact of the energy sector is very difficult to predict accurately, decreased energy demand and energy prices, as well as a sharp decline in oil prices, are already observed. The global energy transition may also be impacted. This joint webinar, organized by IRENA and CEER, discusses the implications of COVID-19 on the energy transition towards a sustainable future, shares insights on consequences faced by the renewable power sector, and possible reactions of energy regulators. This webinar also features in the extended program of the EU Sustainable Energy Week. I am pleased to introduce our speakers, Dr. Annegret Gröbel, CEER President, who is also Director of International Relations at the German Regulatory Authority for Electricity, Gas, Telecommunications, Post and Railway, Bundesnetzagentur in German, as well as Dr. Dolf Gielen, Director of the IRENA Innovation and Technology Center. Without any further delays, let me welcome our first speaker, Dr. Gröbel. Please, the floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me. Yes. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for having me here. I would like to make a few remarks and observations, and of course it is difficult to assess the whole impact. We are just only at the start, but I think some of the, let's say, first effects can be seen, at least the short-term effects. So the first step and also what it meant for energy regulators was always that we saw a lot of emergency decisions taken by governments across all Europe. And that implied immediately also then some measures for the daily, day-to-day work of NRAs, and of course also for energy market actors and grid operators, etc. What we saw that across Europe, NRAs as well as most of the operators started to work from home, and of course also all business, more or less all the business. And that had, of course, a change of demand, a drop in demand. And of course, also it implied that we could not have, as regulators, the usual contacts we have to stakeholders, external stakeholders and consumers. For the operators, it usually meant that they activated quite rapidly their emergency plans to ensure, on the one side, successfully, we have to say, the security of supply, stability of the grid. And what was most important, of course, was that they reorganized the staff and the workers in the control centers. So, for example, they had several shifts so that the staff members wouldn't get into contact with each other, so that there is always also a backup team in case one gets infected from one of the teams. Things like that, and the number of operators also took additional precautions like placing staff in hotels or in containers near to the control centers so that they would have immediate access right away. In that regard, I can give you an example also of what the regulator, in that case BNetzA, my regulator, did. Because we had heard that some of the operators feared that they wouldn't have access to the control centers due to the containment measures. And so what we did was we published a list of all operators that own infrastructure, so that they had, and additionally a template that they could download from our website. And that would allow them to go to the local municipalities, for example, asking for pass-throughs, so that that it was ensured that in case of an emergency, they would be able to pass any sort of police control, etc., and get to the center to be able to do any sort of repair that may be needed. So you see. This is one step which we did, and which ensured, let's say, from the side of the NRAs that there was a guarantee that things went on smoothly, that no interruption would occur. And the first message I would like to make at this point already, before I come to the next slide, is that this also shows that it works, the critical infrastructure being privately owned works, yeah, because of course in former times you wouldn't have had any problems, or you wouldn't have any additional coordination needed. However, as we saw from the measure that I described, it is quite manageable, and to ensure nonetheless that the staff of operators of critical infrastructures like energy networks do get access to operational centers when needed. So that, I think, is maybe a first message. And as I said already, the operators managed very successfully to maintain security of supply as well as stability of the grid. So thank you, and we can come to the next slide, please, Elena. Thank you. So now what did we see in terms of effect? The first one is a picture regarding the renewables, and that is of 20th of April in Germany. And it is quite clear, and that is a topic here of our seminar today. You see the yellow and you see the dark blue as well as the light blue. The dark blue is onshore wind. The yellow, of course, is solar and PV, and the light blue at the bottom is offshore wind, and below it you have biomass. So the clear picture that you see here is that renewable energy sources increased their share dramatically, and we had days when they were providing the energy by 100%. So something that we saw already in the past, that the share of renewable energy is constantly increasing. We saw that this is accelerated during the time of crisis. And as I said before, the grid could cope with it. And now the question is, was the market integration of renewables also working and functioning? And if you look at the diagram below, you see what Elena mentioned as well, that due to, on the one side, a drop of demand, but also because low-cost renewables were used more, we saw a price drop on the wholesale markets. And that shows two things. I think the first one is that the market do work. Renewables can replace let's say, can fill in the situation, can replace conventional fossil energy sources. Without the system, let's say, going down or going bust, everything worked well, and we saw that the markets react as they should. That's why the prices dropped so much. And we saw that renewables were integrated and contributed overall to system security through this diversification, through this renewable integration. And that shows that the system was stable, and renewables played an important part here during the crisis, and contributed in this situation to stabilizing the system. And I think that is the first very important message, that renewables and the share of renewables increased to the benefit of the whole system. And it is interesting what we see in the next slide, which is taken from CEER. We just published recently a paper on unsupported renewables, and the little diagram on the right-hand side shows the capacity that is installed and that will reach the end of the support very soon. But as you have seen, renewables coming into the market and being able to also, let's say, cover substantial parts of energy during the crisis at low prices shows that renewables are becoming competitive. And that is the second message, so that they can survive when the end of the support is arrived, that they can, let's say, withstand in the end of the support and be a competitive part of the market, contributing, as I said, overall to supply of energy in that time. And I think that again is a message that we see that yes, of course, there was initially a need to kick off usage of renewables with supporting them, but we see now that they are becoming or are already competitive, contributing, taking their part and contributing to the system as a whole. So the next generation, of course, will have no, or at least very little support, as can be shown by this picture. And with this, I would like to come to the conclusions. Yes, thank you. So what we saw, what I mentioned already, is that the crisis shows the importance of diversification, integration, and the sustainability of energy production with an increased share of renewables. So that was the message regarding the energy system. What I haven't touched upon yet is the very positive effect that we saw through this increased use of renewables on the climate objectives, on the climate goals, because overall, again, across Europe, we see considerably reduced greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 gas emissions. And of course, that means this is cleaner energy, and with this, the European Union contributes to reaching the goals of the Paris Climate Accord. Yeah, and as I said, taking these two parts together, the benefits for the energy system of using more renewables, and also of withstanding and the system working to cope with this increased renewable situation, and at the same time contributing to reaching the climate goals, shows that we are on our way to a cleaner energy system, and that the crisis pushes this ahead, pushes this conversion and this transition of the energy system towards a clean energy system much faster than we would have expected. What does this mean in terms of for the regulator? Here we see that things moved fast. The overall framework and the system worked well. And of course, we need to question and to see what has the regulator to do in order to support these movements, to bring in, not to, let's say, impede that markets develop in the sense that it reflects efficient price signals. And we have we gave it a name, we labeled it dynamic regulation. And with dynamic regulation, we mean that regulation becomes agile in the sense that it reacts fast, tries to react fast to the developments that we see in the market, that itself accelerated more than was anticipated, so that we are not always one step behind, so that we try to adjust regulation to the market developments, thereby supporting the transition towards clean energy system. Of course, this does not mean that we forget about predictability, so that we change everything overnight. No, rather the opposite. As we have said in our press release, we believe firmly, and I hope I have made this clear, that the regulatory principles, namely also the internal energy market principles that are laid down in the legislation, in the EU regulatory framework and legislative framework, showed that they work well, and that therefore this provides predictability. This is the basis of our activity. And we adjust regulation to the needs of the market development and the grid development, of course, and the energy source development, but on the basis of clear principles, maintaining in that sense predictability of regulatory activity, so that all market players do know how we react. And are credible, and in that sense can then also behave economically rational, which again is then a factor contributing to the overall stability of the system, and keep the markets and the grids functioning and working well. So that is what we contribute in that sense, based on the regulatory principles that prove to work well, keeping the system stable and strong. Last point that I want to make is that as the European Commission announced last week when they presented their revised work program, the idea of the EU next generation funding and recovery package is linked to the Green Deal, which basically means that they say every recovery measure that will be that is planned and will be taken should support the Green Deal going ahead and moving towards a carbon neutral 2050. And European energy regulators had welcomed the Green Deal at the beginning of the year and are very much supporting this idea, and are also now supporting the idea that the crisis is not a pretext to slow down on the energy transition and on moving towards a carbon neutral climate goal, but rather the opposite, that this should reinforce, and that any recovery measure should support the Green Deal, so that indeed, as the European Commission's president put it, the EU economy gets greener, and of course the energy system as well gets greener and cleaner. And I think these two are positively interacting, and that is something where what the energy regulators support very much, and where we want to contribute with implementing dynamic regulation. So in order to foster the system that has proven stable, as I have tried to explain. So many thanks, and I hope we have opportunity to interact with questions later. Thank you.
Dr. Grobe, thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing this perspective with us. I think we saw some of the challenges faced by European system operators, but also some innovations in terms of regulations, but also a reminder that this crisis is not a pretext to hold or to stop in any way the energy transition. Okay, I think we can move now to the next presentation and keep the questions towards the end of this webinar. Dr. Dillon, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena. I want to pick up with at the last point where Dr. Grobe ended, the need to ensure that the stimulus package is indeed conducive for energy transformation, because that is a point where we are currently receiving a lot of questions from our member countries as they are designing these stimulus packages, and there's a lot of debate on how to design these. We are currently conducting that analysis. We plan to come with a report in a few weeks. I will give you now a little bit in this presentation, a little bit of a preview of what we see as important strategies. And the way we have structured that is we look first at what do we see as the long-term energy transition need. Every year we issue a report on that topic. It's called the Global Renewables Outlook. And the last one we issued in April of this year. And so in that report, we conclude that we need to reduce global CO2 emissions by 70% by 2050, perhaps even more, to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And to reach that, we need an energy transformation. And that energy transformation needs to be based on renewables, needs to be based on energy efficiency, and it needs to be based on electrification of end users. So more electricity replacing fossil fuels in buildings, transport, and industry in combination with more renewable power. So these three strategies are really critical, and we conclude that such a transition is technically feasible and it's economically feasible. The investment needs are, of course, significant, between 110 and 130 trillion dollars. but it's not so much higher than a reference case. It's around $95 trillion between now and 2050. So, this significant investment is, of course, also an opportunity shorter term, because it has to start now, because we need investments in capital intensive, in capital stock that has a lifespan of decades. This transition can be used as an important component of these stimulus packages. And we find that there is an important policy case for such transition. We calculated that the benefits exceed the cost by a factor 3 to 8. So for every dollar you invest, you save $3 to $8. You gain $3 to $8. And also you can create significant number of additional jobs, which is of course also very important in the context of today's discussion. We think that there is an opportunity to quadruple the number of jobs in renewables to more than 40 million, and total energy sector jobs can grow to around 100 million. So these are significant numbers in combination with a GDP growth potential in the order of 2.5%. That is important. These are important benefits in the context of the stimulus as well. So that is the long-term outlook. And now the question is, well, what should you do shorter term? How does that fit with what we see now in the crisis and what is needed? Next slide, please. And so, as Dr. Gröbel already explained, we see a number of important developments. Energy demand is down. CO2 emissions are down 5 to 10%. On an annual basis, I should say, is the expectation. We don't know yet exactly, because of course we're only halfway into the year, but that's the numbers around. We see also that the impact on fossil fuels is much more significant than the impact on renewables, and I'll come to that point why that is the case in terms of consumption and generation, but also at the pricing side you see interesting effects. So a very significant drop in fossil fuel prices, which also has its impact on profitability and investment trends. And next one, please. So if you look at the European electricity market, and I took here some numbers for May. If you compare the May 2020 numbers with the same numbers from last year, then the electricity generation and electricity demand was down by about 10%. But if you look on the generation side in more detail, then you see a significant drop in coal and gas-based power generation, 20 to 30% drop. But renewables generation increased by about 8%. And the reason is that because, first of all, last year, of course, we have still added significant new renewable generation capacity that starts to produce this year. And second, that the solar and wind have virtually zero operating cost. So if the marginal cost is zero, that means these plants will operate at their maximum, while for coal and gas-based power generation, of course, there are fuel costs. So that explains this pattern. And so it's the combination of rising renewables generation, falling fossil generation, that makes that the renewables generation share has increased very significantly. So last month, 48% of all power generated in Europe was renewable. So that is a very remarkable number also, because it shows that, of course, also thanks to the good work of the operators and the regulators, this European system operates with these high shares of renewables. So I think that is a number now which also has global relevance, because it shows high shares of variable renewables, solar and wind, is possible also in very large grids. Next one, please. And as I said, I mean, the impacts on the fossil fuel prices have been very significant. So as an example here, I show the natural gas prices in Europe. So the import prices for Russian gas and the import prices, the gas prices in the Dutch system, and they're at about $2 per gigajoule, €2 per gigajoule. So that's a very low price, not seen before. But of course, it's not completely attributable to the crisis, because if you look at the import prices, they have been declining already for some time. So there are also other things going on in the system. It's not only the demand effect, but also important supply effects. But so the gas prices this year have halved. The oil prices have nearly halved. The coal price went down from $70 to $55. So it's a less significant effect, about 20% price reduction. And of course, this change in prices has also affected the relative competitiveness of gas versus coal-based power generation. So that exacerbates the impacts on coal-based generation. And that's why you see that coal-based generation has dropped faster than gas-based generation. Let's go to the next slide. So another important cost component in the power market are the CO2 permit prices. And these have been fairly stable over this year. At around, we're now slightly above 20 euros per ton of CO2. So 20 euros per ton of CO2 translates into incremental cost of about 2 cents per kilowatt hour of coal-based generation, or a cent per kilowatt hour of gas-based generation. So that is also still a very important cost component that, of course, also then affects the competitiveness of renewables versus fossil, and especially versus coal. Next one, please. So for the coming 10 years, we see a global investment need in energy transition of about, or in energy, I should say, of around $59 trillion. The majority of it in clean energy. So energy efficiency, renewables, electrification, grids, etc. That translates in around $4.5 trillion per year that is needed in investments in clean energy. So these are big numbers. There are big numbers being discussed at the moment for stimulus packages, but you see that what is needed in energy is very significant. Next one, please. And if you look at in which markets are these funds needed, of course, East Asia, notably China, is at the moment the largest energy market, followed by North America, followed by Europe. So the amounts that are needed in all three markets are significant. The shares are slightly different, but you see in all three markets a large yellow area, so a lot of investment opportunity in energy efficiency. But then also the blue area and for the dark blue for power generation is very important, and you see also some other investments. Next one, please. So we need a lot of investment. Now, what should now be the priorities? So energy efficiency is an important category. You see that at the moment, many people call for more investments into buildings retrofit and efficiency buildings retrofits. I'll come to that in a minute. Power generation, especially renewable power generation, offers a significant potential. And then electromobility and the enabling infrastructure for that. Now, all these investments, you need to look also from the viewpoint of, can it be ramped up fast enough? Can it be scaled up fast enough? And does it really create jobs and short-term economic growth, which are, of course, priorities in the current situation. And also an important point to make is that we talk about investment numbers, but of course, not everything needs to be done through financial instruments. So regulations, permitting, the competition laws, all of that plays an important role. And by changing things in these areas, you can also mobilize additional investments. Next one, please. So looking a little bit more into the building sector, that's again in a European context, but of course also for other regions that's true. It's a very important market. In 2019, the construction output was around 1.5 trillion euros, around 9% of European economic activity, with around 18 million employees. Now, around a fifth of that was in energy efficiency investments, in retrofits. So, and the renovation rate in Europe over the last couple of years was about a percentage point a year. So 9% efficiency gains for around 12% of the buildings every year. And that needs to increase significantly. We need roughly a tripling of that. So the question then is there now sufficient room in that sector to make that transition happen? And if you look at the construction activity, it was 13% down in March. It was much more down in May. In the major markets, the sector was operating at 60 to 80% of the activity. In some markets, such as Italy, even much lower. So there is significant potential at the moment. The question, of course, is how quickly will that sector recover by its own? And how quickly will policy packages be implemented to use that capacity for these efficiency investments? But it's certain that there is an important potential. Next one, please. Now on solar and wind, this week we released our new costing reports. Every year we do a roundup of worldwide cost of renewables projects. We found that for PV, the costs have fallen by 82% since 2010 and 2019. For onshore wind, they dropped by 39%. And so now, new solar and PV, new solar and wind costs less than not only the new coal capacity in most countries, but even it costs less than operating existing coal plants. So that's a real game changer that can open up a lot of new investments And so this would also be a very important opportunity. So globally, we think that there is an economic opportunity to reduce global CO2 emissions by 5% by introducing much more, by growing these renewable power options faster. Next one, please. So what is now happening in the markets? Well, it's still a bit of course the perspectives keep changing, but what we see is that it was expected to be the best year in solar and wind investments ever. Maybe that's not going to happen. Yeah, maybe we're going to see something which is roughly constant compared to the previous year, or slightly down. We think, therefore, that there is an opportunity, both for large projects, but also we think that rooftop and building integrated PV deserves a lot of attention. And of course, a lot of countries are calling now. We want to set up programs to support both the installations and also manufacturing capacity in these areas more. So there is a financial policy component to it. There's also other types of regulation that can be considered in this context to accelerate deployment. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Gribble said, I mean, technology is important, but we also need this market model to get this market model in place that provides the right price incentives. That is very important. We also need to, there's certain operational practices that need to change if we go to high shares of variable renewables, and also we need new business models, for example, to deal with all the distributed PV, all the distributed batteries, smart charging of EVs, etc. So we found 30 innovative solutions across these 4 dimensions, and by combining them, you can build packages that allow successful operation of power systems with high shares of variable renewables. So all of this is a lot of this is relatively new, and also there are interesting opportunities that could be considered in this context. Next slide, please. So electromobility is, of course, another important aspect for sector coupling. In fact, the sales of EV in the first quarter were double what they were last year. And the impact on the overall EV sales in Europe this year will not be that significant. The reason being that a lot of the providers, the manufacturers, had already sold all their cars for the year. So there is not sufficient manufacturing capacity to expand. So, but let's say the initial projection was roughly an 80% market growth this year. Perhaps in the end, we'll see only a 40 or 50% market growth this year, but still significant growth compared to last year. So there are some impacts, but they will not be that significant. Still, a number of countries, you may have heard, France, for example, put in place a support program. Germany yesterday announced a support program for EV. Also, EV charging is on the agenda, and also there's a lot of attention for new battery factories. EIB had an announcement this week on that. So a lot of attention for investments and for innovations in this sector. Next one, please. Now, my final part is around hydrogen. So hydrogen is a clean energy carrier that can be produced with renewable electricity, so-called green hydrogen. That's an area where there's a lot of attention at the moment. It's starting from a relatively low level. At this moment, 1% of all hydrogen is produced green worldwide. We think that it needs to grow to about 2/3 of production by 2030, and that hydrogen production at least needs to double and maybe even needs to quadruple. And for that, we need a lot of more electrolyzers. We also need a lot more renewable electricity to feed these electrolyzers. So that is an interesting opportunity for cleaning up industry. Some of that hydrogen can also be used to make clean fuels such as ammonia, methanol, liquids for aviation or for shipping. So this is also an innovative opportunity for the coming years and could also be considered as part of a stimulus. So that concludes my remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gielen, for this very rich and insightful presentation. I think we can move on now to the questions and answers. We have, in fact, been monitoring the Q&A panel, and we have also gathered several questions that were submitted by our audience via the registration. So I would like to start directly with one question that is, in fact, directed to both of you. And afterwards, I would like to pick maybe one or two questions and give you the floor. The first question reads as follows. Several positive, but also negative impacts of COVID were observed in the past month in general. However, COVID-19 seems to have a positive impact on the transition towards a sustainable energy future. Is this the case? And more specifically, how do sustainable development goals and the transition towards a renewable future aligned with the Paris Agreement come into place in the main scenarios in a post-COVID world? And maybe I take the opportunity to ask you another question at this point, and you can decide how to address those. The second one refers to innovation. How or could actually the COVID-19 emergency support innovation in the energy sector? And which technology specifically do you think that could be supported after this crisis? You mentioned hydrogen, but maybe there are others. Please, the floor is yours. You can start in which order you want.
Yeah, maybe I start.
Maybe you can go first, yes.
Yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the very good questions. And I agree with your first point that I would also say overall, the impact in terms of accelerating the energy transition through the crisis is positive. I think both of us have shown how the grid and the market and the sources reacted, and that all in all that contribute to reaching the climate targets. So I would clearly say, let's say, as dramatic as the crisis is, this is, I think, a positive effect as we have seen. And we haven't, I mean, you have mentioned, of course, electromobility. I think we should also mention more generally that the transport sector needs to contribute to the climate goals as well by using different types of transport. And I think we have seen here also the effect already from the crisis going also in the right direction, and maybe something that wouldn't have happened without the crisis. I think that is maybe the most important element that we see, that the reactions to the crisis show that much more is possible than we probably thought. And I think that is a positive aspect that and we should keep, let's say, the consequence from this is that we should keep this moment or this movement that we have here. And I think that is important. I would be cautious with regard to naming specific technologies. Our approach as regulators, as we have also expressed it in a paper that we published last November, the gas bridge paper, looking at the role of gas in the energy transition in particular, also touching upon these questions of hydrogen and how this will be integrated and whether it replaces natural gas, etc. And what we have said, and the relationship between electricity and gas, so the whole aspect of what is now called sector integration. Beforehand, it was under the label or the name of sector coupling. And one of the aspects that we mention is that we think that we should be technological neutral, so that there shouldn't be that we shouldn't be favoring one or the other technology, because it is up finally to the market to see which one is the most promising. And usually the regulator wouldn't get it right, and he shouldn't second guess the market. That is our convincing. Therefore, I wouldn't like to say anything that is more promising, because simply as a regulator, I would let's say overstepping my my remit and my responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe Dr. Gillen would like to add something on this specific point on innovation and technologies, but also on the broader picture.
Yeah, certainly. Let me try. I mean, I made a point. We see a significant need for innovation. But it's always a bit the question: what exactly do you call innovation? Innovation has an R&D component and it has a deployment component. And both are important, but if you look at the financing needed for both, then you need 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more funds for the deployment than for the R&D. And also the R&D has specific dynamics. So it's not just a matter of throwing more money at the problem and you solve it short term, because you also need, for example, the brains and the expertise to develop these technologies, which takes time. So while there is some opportunity for investments in this RD&D component, probably the bulk of the investments needs to go to the deployment side. And that is also where then is the bulk of the opportunity to create jobs and to create economic growth short term. But of course, for the longer term growth, this RD&D component is really important. So you need both, but you need to find the right balance.
That is very clear. Thank you very much for both your answers. I think we will stay for 1 or 2 more questions in this area around technologies, but also enabling technologies. So not just the power generating technologies, as you just illustrated, but also others. So there's one specific question around e-mobility. So how do you see this shaping up in the next 10 years? And another question refers to digitalization. So here the participant is asking, do you think that the digitalization in the power sector would be embraced more rapidly after the events observed in the past 2 months? So I think we already heard a little bit about the aspect of the pace, but what would be your opinion on this? Again, maybe this time, Dr. Gillen, you can start, and perhaps Dr. Gröbel, you could add afterwards. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Looking at the first point of electromobility, so we see that that is clearly accelerating in Europe. We see that there is a recognition that of course, you need to push the car sales, but you also need the charging infrastructure in place. And that is both public charging infrastructure and also, let's say, the residential and the offices. And there are some regulatory issues and some permitting issues around that maybe could be looked at. The other part is the half of the cost of an electric vehicle is in the battery. So the battery is really crux. There's a lot of attention also for new battery facilities in Europe. There's also now, I mean, there was, for example, this week news that there's now idea of also building a battery recycling factory, which I think is also a very good idea. There is recognition that it's a fairly complex sector. You need to work on all these aspects. Perhaps one aspect which is not yet sufficiently on the radar is the integration of these electric vehicles with these variable renewables on the supply side. So you will need smart grids there. You will need price signals there to really charge these cars when there is sufficient renewable power available. So that is maybe one aspect. Now, digitalization. So smart grids is really essential to smoothly operate grids and to create sufficient flexibility to allow the integration of these high shares of variable renewables. And so that should definitely also be part of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Would you like to add something on these points, or do you have a different opinion perhaps on this, Dr. Gröbel?
Not a different opinion. I very much agree with what was said. Let me start with the digitalization. I think clearly the answer to this question is yes. I would expect that there is an accelerated acceptance of digitalization and of moving forward more with smart grids, in particular on the DS level. So that is, in my view, an obvious point, and again, this is being accelerated very much by the crisis, I think. The electromobility, I think that is something that is probably more of a midterm effect, and it's difficult to say in which way this is affected by the crisis. I agree with the points that Dr. Doan was making, that you do not need only an electric vehicle, but you need the charging infrastructure. But that is something, let's say, this statement was made, could have been made in a similar way before the crisis as well. So that is more of a kind of a structural issue. And the other element here to have in place, let's say, a good framework that allows charging and also providing energy to the system, to the grid, is key. And the two things I want to add in that regard is, one, this implies that the grids may have to be reinforced, and that the system has to be designed in such a way that the additional flexibility needed to make this working at the DS level is important. And I think there the regulator has to play a large part, and we are looking at this as well, and how to enable that flexibility can be provided, for example, by demand side flexibility, by using the charging mechanism of electric vehicles, so that they do not only take electricity from the grid, but that they are also providing electricity. But that works only if the flexibility mechanism, let's say, and the price signals work. But that is something, again, which I think is let's say, not affected too much by the crisis, but is a midterm issue to solve anyhow, in order to reap the benefits also from an increased electromobility. And in that sense, again, I come back to the point I was making before. This means that we have to look also at the sector coupling or sector integration with the transport sector much more. So if this is going beyond, let's say, the energy system transition, this impacts, or this comprises also sector integration with transport sector, for example, in order to have the economy as a whole in a clean sense. Let's say the only thing that we can say that where it is linked to the corona crisis is what we said before, that the stimulus package should foster the Green Deal, and should not be, let's say, forget about implementing the Green Deal and getting the Green Deal moving in that way. So there is a link to the crisis. Otherwise, I would say the electric vehicle or electric mobility aspects are maybe less affected than others. For digitalization, as I said, this is different, and that of course is again, it's a positive element that we see coming from the crisis.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I see that we're running a little bit out of time. What I would suggest at this point is that we take one more question before we wrap it up, if that's fine for you. So this would mean that we will stay for 5 more minutes online. Okay, so there's one question, and I think it would be interesting to hear your recommendations, your key recommendations in a couple of words regarding the EU stimulus package for economic recovery, in order to align this with the carbon neutrality target by 2050. So there were a couple of elements which we already heard, but here there's also an interest from the participant to learn about the impact on the European internal energy market. So if you would like to add any final words and reply to this, that would be very much appreciated. Perhaps this one, Dr. Giel, would you like to start?
Well, as it's about markets, maybe Dr. Bremer wants to start.
Yes, I think the Green Deal sets out the right principles, and like the clean energy package from 2019, pushes the principles of a market-based energy transition further, in order to include, as I said before, also other sectors, not only the energy sector. And we think that this is an important element in order to reach the climate targets. Of course, the energy system is one of the sectors of the economy that absolutely need to become cleaner. But there, a lot of elements have been set by the framework, by the clean energy package already, at least for the Union. And in my sense, in that way, the clean energy, the Green Deal, pushes this idea further by looking in particular at aspects like the sector integration. And that has 2 aspects. One is, of course, the integration of electricity and of gas, and a lot of things there need to be, let's say, made consistent, because sometimes now you have different pricing, different tariffing principles, etc. and there you need to look in particular also at gas and hydrogen, as we saw, and how would they fit into the system of, for example, the network development plans. And the other aspect is the broader integration of other sectors of the economy to make the economy as a whole cleaner, because otherwise we will not reach this 70% reduction that is needed in the greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore, given the amount that is and the challenge that is linked to reaching the climate goals and the goals of the Paris Agreement, it is, I think, a very good moment in time to use the stimulus package exactly to pursue and to push these objectives. So I would even say it is a sort of ideal combination. And as I said before, with all carefulness, given if there is something positive from the crisis, I think it is to keep this momentum, that things can be accelerated more than we anticipated before, after the crisis, if we learn the lessons based on the regulatory principles that are successful, and that is mainly a market-based approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Maybe I can add one point. So I would fully agree that Europe is a leader in this, and discussion here is going in the right direction. But of course, if you look at the global picture, we still have a bit of a challenge. This is not the case everywhere. So maybe also in an international context, Europe can play a role to put the global developments in the right direction through its international weight and through its development cooperation.
Thank you very much. There is one question which was also asked, and I think this is very interesting, but we will keep this for our next joint webinar. But nevertheless, I would like to read it out, and the interest is as follows. Would it be possible to explain to what extent the dynamic regulation has caused or has contributed to increase the share of renewable energy up to 48% in Europe in the total generation? And I would like to make now a couple of final announcements. For those of you who would like to learn more about our work, we have a fortnightly IRENA Insights webinar series. And the next one will take place next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Central European Summer Time. And our colleague Michael Taylor will present the latest trends and drivers of renewable power generation costs in 2019. So registration is already open via the link on the screen. And regarding the last question that I just read out loud, I think it would be a great opportunity if you could join us during the next joint webinar organized by CEER and IRENA on the 20th of July at 4 p.m. Central European Summer Time, where we will address exactly this topic, as well as enabling technologies and especially digital technologies in the energy transition. Until then, I would like to warmly thank our audience for having asked plenty of highly relevant questions, to which our speakers have provided thought-provoking insights. So once again, Dr. Gröbel and Dr. Gillen, thank you very much for your captivating presentations, which are surely of great value to our audience. Goodbye and see you soon online.